I can still feel the cold brightness of that store when I think about the day my life finally stopped dividing itself into secret rooms. I had believed, right up until the sliding doors opened and the smell of perfume and clean fabric met me in the face, that Kathy was teasing me, that the dare she had pressed into my ear back at home would dissolve on the drive over, that she would laugh, squeeze my hand, and take me somewhere ordinary instead. But she parked, turned off the engine, and looked at me with that calm, steady expression that had always frightened me more than anger ever could. "You know, if you walk away now," she said quietly, "you'll spend the next 10 years pretending you don't want this." That was Kathy. She did not shout when she wanted the truth. She placed it between us and waited to see if I could bear looking at it. I remember staring through the windshield at the mannequins in the window, at the pale blouses and soft knit tops and polished brass rails, and feeling as if I were about to walk into a memory I had spent my whole life trying to misplace. Years have passed since then, enough years that I have learned how strange it is that a life can turn not through grand events, but through ordinary humiliations, through fluorescent lights and carpeted fitting rooms, and a wife who knows exactly where your fear ends and your longing begins. When I tell this story now, I never begin in the store for long, because the truth is that I had been walking toward that doorway since I was a child, long before I had words for any of it, long before I knew that wanting softness could unsettle an entire family, long before I understood that identity can grow in the dark for years and still arrive in full daylight one afternoon, when you are least prepared to meet it. I grew up in a house where everything had a place and every person was expected to know theirs. My father believed in structure the way some men believe in prayer. He rose early, shaved carefully, folded the newspaper into neat quarters, and moved through the morning with the quiet authority of someone who never doubted that the world made sense. My mother carried a different kind of order, softer at the edges, but just as firm. She ironed pillowcases. She kept spare buttons in old cookie tins. She knew which aunt was still upset about some forgotten comment from Christmas 6 years earlier. My older brother belonged in my father's world, as if he had been cut from the same pattern. He liked baseball, noise, competition, all the things that seemed to make the adults nod with relief. My younger sister, Marianne, drifted through rooms with ribbons trailing from her wrists and stories tumbling out of her mouth, and no one seemed bothered that she could become anyone she liked before supper. I was the child who lingered at thresholds. I watched before I entered. I noticed things no one else seemed to think mattered. The difference between winter cotton and summer cotton, the sound of my mother's bracelets against the kitchen counter, the way my grandmother's coat always smelled faintly of violet powder and rain. I learned early that attention itself can become a kind of hiding place. If you are quiet enough, people mistake your silence for good behavior. They do not suspect that you are building another life inside it. Some of my first memories are made of fabric. I remember sitting on the floor while my mother folded laundry into neat piles, letting my fingers trail over slips and camisoles before she told me not to wrinkle them. I remember the cool feel of nylon stockings before I knew what they were called, the almost ceremonial way my grandmother rolled them in her hands before dressing for church. There was a chest in her guest room filled with old scarves, gloves with tiny pearl buttons, brooches wrapped in tissue. And once, when I was maybe 7, I lifted the lid and found myself standing there for a long time just looking. Not taking anything, not daring to try anything on, only looking. It felt wrong in the way beautiful things often feel wrong to children who have already started dividing themselves into allowed and forbidden. At family holidays, my cousins played rough in the yard while I drifted back inside and found reasons to remain near the women. I liked the kitchen talk, the lower voices, the stories told while someone snapped beans or laid out napkins. My aunts discussed colors, cuts, church committees, babies, disappointments, recipes, neighbors who were trying too hard, and I listened as if they were describing an entire country hidden inside the one I lived in. I do not mean that I wanted to be them exactly, at least not then. It was more confusing and more ordinary than that. I wanted access to the atmosphere around them, to the permission they seemed to have to care about texture, gesture, expression, feeling. The men in my family were permitted appetite and opinion. The women were permitted detail. I did not know how to explain, even to myself, that detail felt like oxygen. The first time I put on something that was not meant for me, It was an accident if judged from the outside, and nothing like an accident from within. Marianne had left one of her play scarves on the banister. It was flimsy and pink and entirely unimportant to anyone but me. I remember glancing down the hall, hearing the television in the den, hearing pots in the kitchen, and winding it once around my neck. I felt no thunderclap, no revelation, only a sudden stillness, as if the noise in my head had shifted one step farther away. I untied it immediately and put it back, but the sensation lingered for hours. That became a pattern before I knew it had one. A ribbon touched and replaced. A cardigan held against my chest when no one was home. One of my mother's old nightgowns lifted from the laundry basket and pressed to my face for no reason I could have spoken aloud. I was not driven by anything wild or theatrical. It was private, almost devotional. I was not pretending to be someone else, so much as listening for myself somewhere in the soft things no one would have handed me if I had asked. Children measure themselves against what earns smiles and what earns silence. By the time I was 10, I knew which version of me made adults comfortable. At school, I learned to perform enough boyhood to avoid attention. I laughed when expected. I joined games without loving them. I let my father teach me to throw a ball, to grip a wrench, to stand with my shoulders squared. He was never cruel. I want to be fair to him. He loved me in the only language he trusted, through instruction, through expectation, through the belief that competence would protect me from the world. When he saw me hesitating, he mistook it for timidity and tried to harden me against it. "Stand up straight," he would say. "Don't drift." He hated what he called drifting. He could not have known that drifting was how I survived. My mother saw more, though even now I am not sure how much. Once, when she found me in the hallway tracing the lace at the edge of a tablecloth, she watched me for a beat too long before saying, gently, "You always notice pretty things." I carried that sentence for years. It comforted me and frightened me at the same time. Comfort because someone had seen me without immediately correcting me. Fear because being seen at all felt dangerous. Adolescence did what it does to many private children. It made secrecy feel both necessary and impossible. Everything became more public just as I felt myself retreating farther inward. Bodies changed, voices dropped, locker rooms turned into theaters of unspoken rules, and I learned the exhausting craft of appearing casual. My brother thrived during those years. He grew broader, louder, more certain. My sister became elegant in the loose, unself-conscious way girls sometimes do before the world fully teaches them to doubt their own reflection. I became watchful. I studied how boys mocked softness in each other, as if they were afraid it might spread by contact. I listened to the cruelty that passed as joking. I saw how even minor differences could turn someone into a target. I also saw, with an ache I could not admit, how much freedom girls seemed to have in the realm of self-presentation. Not freedom from judgment, of course. I was not naive even then. But a girl could care about clothes without explanation. A girl could examine herself in the mirror and be thought ordinary. A girl could ask if her blouse worked with her skirt, could speak about fit and line and color, could build a self out of visible choices. I wanted that language. I wanted the right to fuss, to refine, to shape. Instead, I learned to bury those impulses under the dull costume of adequacy. By then, I had a secret routine. It embarrasses me to admit how meticulously I constructed it, but honesty is the only reason to tell a story like this. On afternoons when I knew the house would be empty, I would go to my parents' room or, later, to my sister's when she was away at a friend's, and try things in fragments. Never enough to feel transformed, only enough to touch the edges of it. A camisole under my shirt for 10 minutes. A pair of stockings rolled on and off. A soft house robe tied, and then untied before panic could take over. I always put everything back exactly where I found it. That was part of the ritual too, the restoration, the proof that nothing had happened. Yet something always had happened. Every small act changed the shape of my inner life. I began thinking of myself in ways I could not articulate. Not as a different person exactly, not yet, but as someone with two forms of breathing. One was shallow and public. The other was private and full. I knew enough about the world to understand that there were words floating around out there about men like me, but those words arrived wrapped in ridicule or scandal. They belonged to television punchlines, whispered gossip, the cautionary tone adults used when discussing distant people whose lives had supposedly gone wrong. None of that matched what I felt. I did not feel perverse. I felt lonely. I felt unfinished. I felt as if some tender part of me had been given no ordinary way to exist. My extended family reinforced that loneliness without ever meaning to. At reunions, the men migrated towards sports, politics, repairs, and practical complaints. The women traded stories and sympathy, and I hovered uneasily between the two camps, welcome in neither for long. I was too mild for the men, too carefully supervised for the women. An aunt would smile and send me outside. An uncle would clap my shoulder and tell me to toughen up. Cousins learned before I did that discomfort in a family becomes comedy if no one wants to examine it. Tom's with the ladies again. They would laugh, and I would laugh too, because children learn to volunteer for the joke before someone assigns it to them. My grandmother, who noticed everything and exposed almost nothing, once took my hand while we were clearing dishes and said, "There are many ways to be a good man. Most people only know one." I did not understand then whether she was comforting me or warning me. Perhaps both. Memory turns elders wiser than they may really have been, but I returned to that sentence often. It suggested a generosity my younger self was hungry for, even if it still trapped me inside the word man when I had already begun to suspect I was listening for something broader, blurrier, less obedient to categories. College gave me privacy, but not peace. It is tempting to say that leaving home allowed me to become myself, but that would be too simple. It allowed me, mostly, to become more methodical in my division. I shared dorm rooms with boys who lived in a cloud of noise and carelessness, and I seemed ordinary enough beside them because I had learned how to keep order around my secrets. I bought my own things cautiously, always from stores far from campus, always with the pulse-racing conviction that everyone could tell. A plain camisole first, then underwear no one else would see, then a simple bra I kept hidden in a shoebox at the back of my closet. The first time I bought it, I stood in line with my face burning and an explanation prepared that no one asked for. The cashier barely looked at me. That, too, was revelatory. I had imagined public judgment where there was only boredom. But private shame does not dissolve just because the world fails to notice it. Back in my room, alone at last, I tried everything on and sat on the edge of my bed feeling both calmer and sadder than before. Calmer because the inner pressure eased when I let myself inhabit softness. Sadder because the relief made clear that I was not dealing with a passing curiosity. Something in me had continuity. It returned after stress, after loneliness, after ordinary days. It returned because it belonged to me. I dated women in those years and cared for some of them genuinely, but intimacy frightened me because I assumed that being known would end in disgust. I became practiced at partial honesty. I could speak about insecurity, childhood, family pressure, ambition, fear of disappointing people. I could not say, "There's a part of my life made of fabrics and mirrors and longing, and I do not know whether it means I want to be seen as a woman or simply need room to live outside manhood's narrow frame." So I said nothing. Silence becomes heavier with age. It gathers proof around itself. If you remain quiet long enough, you begin mistaking concealment for identity. After college, I moved, worked, dated less, read more, and found small private routines that felt almost sustainable. I would come home from work, lock the apartment door, shower, and change into the softer self I only allowed to exist in solitude. The world outside remained firmly divided. Inside, I let myself breathe. Then I met Kathy, and for the first time in my life, I had the unnerving experience of being loved by someone who was neither fooled by my performance nor frightened by what lay underneath it. She was not dramatic, not reckless, not interested in prying for the sake of shock. She simply paid attention. She noticed that I lingered in clothing stores while pretending not to. She noticed that I knew more than most men about fabrics and cuts. She noticed how easily I spoke with women when conversation turned toward appearance, mood, domestic detail, the private architecture of daily life. We were friends before we were anything else, and perhaps that saved me. By the time we married, She knew my silences well enough to hear the shape of what they were hiding. I told her in pieces. First, that I felt comfort in women's clothing. Then that it was not a joke, not a costume, not something performed for anyone. Then that I had been carrying it for years. Kathy listened without flinching. She asked careful questions. She did not rush to name me. That restraint remains one of the kindest gifts anyone has ever given me. She never said, "This is what you are." She said, "Tell me how it feels." No one had ever asked me that before. Our early marriage was built on these strange combinations of tenderness and caution. She would buy me something small now and then, a pair of panties folded in tissue, a camisole she claimed would feel more like you than those stiff t-shirts. She teased me gently, but never in a way that made me feel reduced. At home, I found a kind of peace I had never known. After work, I changed. I moved through the house with less tension in my shoulders. I began paying attention to posture, to skincare, to the ordinary rituals of grooming that had once seemed inaccessible to me. None of it felt theatrical. It felt like translation. Kathy sometimes watched me from the doorway with a fond, thoughtful expression, as if she were observing someone emerge from deep water. Yet even in those safe rooms, I kept boundaries. Home was one world, outside another. I could wear a bra in the evening, yes, but only under the protection of locked doors and drawn curtains. I told myself I was content with that arrangement. In truth, I was terrified of testing it. I had built an identity out of managing exposure. Public visibility felt like annihilation. Kathy understood this long before I did. She saw that my comfort at home was becoming another hiding place, softer than the old ones, but still a cage. We argued about it in gentle circles for months. She would say, "You don't have to become public before you're ready, but you do need to stop treating yourself like a shameful secret." I would insist there was a difference between privacy and shame. She would nod, then ask, "Why does the thought of someone else seeing you feel like disaster?" I had no answer that didn't crumble under inspection. Eventually, she proposed what she called, with maddening calm, a small act of honesty. We were going to buy proper underthings, fitted correctly, not the improvised assortment I had collected over the years. I thought she meant online. She meant a store. I laughed because the alternative was panic. She did not laugh back. She said if I wanted to keep insisting this was part of my real life, then my real life could no longer depend entirely on secrecy. I protested, delayed, bargained, and then one Saturday she picked up her keys and told me it was time. That brings me back to the store, to the dizzy brightness, to the terrible sense that every step toward the entrance was peeling away an old layer of camouflage. Kathy took my arm, not roughly, not tenderly either, just steadily. "You can hate me for an hour," she murmured, "if it helps you stop hiding for 10 more years. Inside, a sales associate approached with the professional warmth of someone who had seen every human expression a fitting room can produce. I could barely speak. Kathy, of course, could. She smiled and said, with a composure I envied and resented in equal measure, that we needed help with sizing and support, and that I was nervous. There was nothing mocking in her tone, which somehow made the moment more intense. If she had treated it as a joke, I could have hidden inside the joke. Instead, she treated it as ordinary, and I had to stand there inside the ordinariness of my own truth. The saleswoman, whose name was Sally, did not blink. She simply nodded and said we could step into a fitting room. I remember absurd details from those next minutes. The click of hangers against the rail, the muted carpet under my shoes, the shape of my own hands when I pulled off my shirt and tried not to shake. Sally noticed the camisole I had worn beneath, and instead of reacting with curiosity or contempt, she smiled as if I had already arrived farther than I realized. Kathy stood nearby, not crowding me, not rescuing me. Sally measured me efficiently, talking the whole time in a calm, matter-of-fact voice that made breathing easier. She asked what kinds of support felt comfortable, what shapes I preferred under clothing, whether I wanted something discreet or something that would help me adjust to a fuller silhouette. I could barely answer. Kathy answered some things for me, but what mattered was not the specific garment she chose. What mattered was that 2 women were standing with me in a bright little room, discussing my presentation as if my comfort and my self-recognition were practical realities worthy of attention. I had expected humiliation. Instead, I encountered a more destabilizing thing: simple acceptance. Sally brought several bras, each with a slightly different structure and feeling. One was soft and lightly shaped. Another gave a more defined line beneath clothing. A third felt almost old-fashioned in its construction, the kind of thing I might once have dismissed as too conspicuous. Kathy urged me to try each one, not because she wanted spectacle, but because she could see what I was finally beginning to understand. The body can change emotionally before it changes visibly, and sometimes a person needs to see a possibility reflected back at them before they can admit they have been imagining it all along. When I looked in the mirror with that first properly fitted bra under the camisole, I felt a shock that had little to do with the garment itself. I looked composed, intentional, not like a frightened man playing at softness in a locked house, but like someone who had, however tentatively, chosen a shape. Kathy saw my face in the mirror and said quietly, "There you are." No one had ever said anything more dangerous to me. Of course, I panicked almost immediately. I worried about how visible it was, whether strangers would know, whether I looked absurd, whether I had crossed some invisible line from private comfort into public claim. Kathy, with the impatience of someone tired of watching me apologize for existing, began choosing coordinating pieces and practical things I would need if I was finally going to stop treating this part of myself as temporary. A girdle because she knew I liked the sense of structure and poise it gave me. Matching underwear because she thought if I was going to do this I should not do it halfway. A blouse because my old shirt no longer sat over the fitted shape the way it had before. That was the moment the room tilted again. I had thought perhaps I could hide the whole experiment under my usual clothes. Kathy refused that compromise. If I walked out dressed exactly as I had walked in, I would tell myself the afternoon had not counted. She knew me too well. So she and Sally chose a soft pink sweater that traced the line of my torso more gently than anything I had ever worn outside the house. When I put it on and looked up, I felt grief before I felt relief. Grief for all the years I had denied myself this simple visual harmony. Grief because I liked what I saw, and liking it made the future impossible to shrink back into the size it had been that morning. I begged in whispers, asked if we could take the clothes home and treat the public part as some later, separate challenge. Kathy came close then, not to threaten me but to anchor me. "Tom," she said, "you have spent your whole life saying later. Later has become another word for never. I am not asking you to become anyone overnight. I'm asking you to survive being seen for 5 minutes." There are moments when love feels indistinguishable from pressure, and perhaps that is because love sometimes recognizes the edge of our old cage more clearly than we do. I was angry with her. I was grateful. I was frightened enough to shake. I was also, beneath all of it, tired of disappearing. So I stayed dressed. Sally rang up the purchases with the same professional ease she had shown from the beginning. Kathy made me carry the bags. At the counter, she reminded me to stand straight, to stop folding in on myself, to breathe. I expected stares when we walked back through the store, through the mall, into the open air. There were glances, yes, the ordinary registering glances people cast at anything slightly outside their expectation, but no collapse of the world followed. No laughter rose behind me like a wave. No one pointed. The ceiling stayed up. The floor stayed firm. I discovered, in those trembling steps through public space, that my fear had been louder than reality. What I remember most from that walk was not other people. It was my own body reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity. The fitted underthings altered my posture. The sweater changed how I held my shoulders. My pace softened without my meaning it to. I had spent so long moving as though I were apologizing for taking up space that the simple act of carrying myself with care felt almost radical. Kathy noticed before I did. "There," she said when we reached the car. "That's the walk you always have at home." I laughed shakily because she was right. Something private had slipped into daylight. I was still terrified, but terror was no longer the only thing in me. There was also curiosity. There was a strange, cautious pride. There was, for the first time, The possibility that the person I had been in secret might not vanish the moment the world touched them. Back home, I stood in front of the bedroom mirror while Kathy sorted the shopping bags. She told me to box up my old underwear for a while, not as punishment, not as erasure, but as a way of stopping me from running backward out of reflex. I thought she was being severe. Years later, I think she was trying to protect the fragile momentum of the day. Left alone with my reflection, I saw not a finished person, but the beginning of coherence. The silhouette was different, yes, but what struck me more was the expression on my face. I looked less hunted. I looked, in some small and fragile way, relieved. Kathy came up behind me then, wrapped her arms around my waist, and rested her chin on my shoulder. "I knew you would recognize yourself," she whispered. I started to cry, not dramatically, just the quiet tears of a man who has reached the edge of a truth and finds that it hurts less than the years of avoiding it. "I don't know what this makes me," I admitted. Kathy did not answer with a label. She kissed my temple and said, "You don't have to know tonight. You only have to stop lying to yourself about what brings you peace." That night did not transform me completely. Real life is slower and messier than turning points suggest. The next morning I woke with the thick embarrassment of someone replaying every second of public vulnerability. I wanted to dismiss the whole thing as one reckless afternoon. Instead, I found that I could not stop thinking about how ordinary it had felt once the initial panic passed. Ordinary and therefore impossible to confine again to fantasy. Over the next weeks, Kathy nudged rather than pushed. She encouraged me to wear the properly fitted pieces at home, then under more neutral clothes on errands where no one knew me. She taught me practical things with a patience that was sometimes exasperating in its gentleness. How different fabrics draped, how grooming altered not just appearance but mood, how a little attention to color and proportion could make me feel settled rather than disguised. These may sound like shallow details, but for me they were forms of literacy. I had been denied, and had denied myself, an education in self-presentation that many women absorb gradually through adolescence and family life. Learning it in adulthood felt both tender and heartbreaking. Each small skill came with a shadow thought. So this is what I was missing all those years. Family complicated everything, of course. It is one thing to shift quietly inside a marriage. It is another to let any of that softness approach the people who taught you what a son was supposed to be. Kathy believed, correctly, that I could not keep dividing my life forever, but she also understood that disclosure moves at the speed of the most frightened part of a person. We began with almost nothing visible. Better skincare, better posture, softer knitwear in colors I would once have dismissed as too delicate. Underlayers that changed how I moved, without announcing themselves. My mother noticed first, though she did not mention it directly. At Sunday lunch, she touched my sleeve and said, "That color suits you." It was a pale blue I had chosen because it felt safe, but even that small approval undid me a little. My sister noticed more and pretended not to make it a subject until I brought it to her myself. Marianne had grown into one of those women who can disarm pain with wit, and when I finally told her, voice shaking, that I had been exploring a more feminine side of myself for years, she blinked once and said, "Tom, I used to wonder how long it would take you to admit you always cared more about cardigans than cars." Then she hugged me so hard I laughed in spite of myself. Not everyone made it easy, but those early moments of recognition mattered. They told me that I had not imagined all the clues scattered through my life. My father was harder. He did not erupt. In some ways, silence can be more difficult than anger because it offers no shape to respond to. When he first realized that my appearance was changing in ways he did not understand, he studied me as if I were speaking a language he had once known as a child and long since forgotten. He asked if Kathy was influencing me. The question hurt more than I expected because it reduced my entire inner history to a spouse's preference. For perhaps the first time in my life, I answered him without softening it for his comfort. I told him Kathy had not created this in me. She had only refused to help me keep burying it. He looked away then, and for a while we lived in that difficult distance families know too well, the space where love remains but certainty does not. My mother bridged what she could. She sent small offerings of normalcy, a scarf at Christmas, a comment about a blouse, a recipe card tucked into a parcel with hand cream. She was telling me, in the only way she knew, that domestic tenderness need not be revoked just because the map of the family was shifting. Extended relatives varied. Some asked clumsy questions. Some became careful to the point of stiffness. Some pretended not to notice anything at all. Yet the sky did not fall. That, too, became part of my education. Fear imagines exile as the only outcome. Real life usually offers something messier: awkwardness, adaptation, pockets of grace, moments of loss, moments of unexpected acceptance. As my outer life changed in increments, my inner language changed too. For a long time I had thought only in terms of clothing, permission, relief. Slowly, I began understanding that what moved me was not the garments alone, but the self I became inside them. I felt more honest when I allowed softness into my presentation, more emotionally legible, less trapped inside an inherited performance of manhood that had never fit without strain. That realization did not arrive as a dramatic declaration. It came through repetition, through noticing how my voice changed when I was comfortable, how my friendships deepened when I stopped guarding every gesture, how much easier it became to think about the future when I was not spending all my energy managing concealment. Kathy and I talked late into many nights. Was this about expression, identity, both? Neither? Did I want a new name? Different pronouns? A fuller social transition? Some answers emerged, others did not. What mattered most was that the questions themselves no longer felt forbidden. They felt like the natural work of a life finally being lived from the inside. There was grief in it, more than I expected. People talk a great deal about liberation, and not enough about mourning. I mourned the child who had stood in hallways touching banister scarves and wondering why beauty felt off-limits. I mourned the teenager who learned to laugh at himself before others could do it for him. I mourned the young man who mistook secrecy for safety and lived in constant rehearsal for a judgment that often existed only in his own frightened imagination. I even mourned parts of the identity I had inhabited for years simply because they were familiar. Change, however right, still requires burial. There were days I felt silly, artificial, exposed, too old to be learning what many people learn at 14. On those days, Kathy would remind me that delayed honesty is still honesty. Mary Ann would send me some absurd note about shoes or lipstick or family gossip, refusing to let my self-seriousness turn the process into tragedy alone. My mother, in her careful way, kept offering ordinary kindness. My father, slowly and with obvious effort, began asking practical rather than alarmed questions. Could I still help him fix the porch rail? Of course I could. Did I want coffee? Yes. He would look at me longer than before, but eventually the looks became less bewildered. I do not think he ever entirely understood. Understanding and love are not always identical, and maturity sometimes means learning to receive the second when the first cannot fully arrive. The memory of that store remained central because it was the first time I discovered that being seen did not erase me. Years later, I returned there alone once, not because I needed anything urgent, but because I wanted to meet that earlier version of myself with more tenderness. The fitting rooms were smaller than I remembered. The lights were still unforgiving. A different sales associate helped me, and the whole errand took 20 minutes. I sat in my car afterward and laughed until I cried. So much of the terror that had ruled me had attached itself to places and acts that, once crossed, became almost ordinary. That ordinariness is one of the deepest comforts of my life now. I do not mean that every day is easy. The world still notices difference in ways that can bruise. Family histories do not untangle neatly. Identity itself remains more fluid, more alive, than the tidy endings people like to impose on stories such as mine. Some days I feel close to the man I was raised to be, only softened and widened and made truthful. Some days I feel I spent too many years forcing myself into that shape, and that what I am now is not an adjustment but a return. I no longer need to solve the question every morning before breakfast. I have learned that a life can be real even when its vocabulary continues to evolve. If I sound calmer now than the frightened person in the store, it is because time has taught me that the self does not emerge all at once. It gathers. It repeats. It asks again and again for room. When I look back, I do not see one dramatic awakening so much as a chain of tiny permissions. The scarf on the banister, my mother saying I noticed pretty things, my grandmother's cryptic mercy, the secret purchases in college, the evenings at home when my shoulders dropped and I could breathe, Kathy's unwavering refusal to let me call my own peace ridiculous, Marianne's laughter dissolving shame, even my father's slow, imperfect effort to remain present while his understanding lagged behind. All of it made me. The day in the store was simply the moment when those hidden years became visible enough that I could no longer pretend they belonged to some side room of my life. They were my life. I still remember coming home that first day, the bags on the bed, the mirror catching me from an angle I could not avoid, Kathy's hands warm on my waist as she held me from behind. I remember how frightened I was of the next step and the next after that. I remember thinking, with equal parts dread and wonder, that perhaps my old life had not ended so much as opened. Kathy asked me then, very softly, "Can you feel the difference between embarrassment and wrongness?" It took me a long moment to answer. Then I said yes. Embarrassment burns and passes. Wrongness settles like a stone. What I felt that day, beneath all the fear, was not wrongness. It was recognition. And once you have recognized yourself, even dimly, even trembling, it becomes very hard to go back to living as a stranger.